They came for his land without warning. The HOA declared James Harrison's backyard, the haven where his children played, was now for the community. When he refused, HOA President Caroline Brooks smugly warned him of fines, lawsuits, and endless stress. She was confident he'd fold just like everyone else. But Caroline had no idea who she was dealing with. James had uncovered their lies, fake documents, stolen funds, and a scheme that would bring the HOA to its knees. What happened next shocked everyone. But let's start at the beginning. The morning began like any other, with the comforting rituals that made weekends feel special. James Harrison stood in his kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the crisp scent of the early autumn air, drifting in through the open window. Outside, his kids' laughter echoed across the yard as they raced each other toward the old oak tree in the corner, a tree James' father had planted decades ago. It wasn't just a yard. It was a part of their family's history, a place where birthdays were celebrated, barbecues sizzled on warm evenings, and countless memories were etched into the soil. James loved this space, not just for what it was, but for what it represented: peace, stability, and a connection to the life he had built for his family. He took another sip of coffee, the warmth of the mug grounding him as he watched his children chase their golden retriever, Max, across the lawn. It was the kind of idyllic scene he didn't take for granted. Then the doorbell rang. The sharp, insistent chime cut through the tranquility, immediately pulling James out of his peaceful reverie. Placing his coffee on the counter, he moved toward the door, glancing briefly at the clock. It was early for visitors. As he opened the door, he was met with the sight of Caroline Brooks, the president of the HOA. Caroline was impeccably dressed, as always. Her tailored blazer and perfectly styled hair gave her an air of authority, but James had learned not to be fooled by appearances. Caroline wasn't just a stickler for rules. She was a manipulator, someone who thrived on control. Her smile was polite, almost too polite, and the clipboard in her hand suggested that this wasn't a casual visit. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the practiced cheerfulness of someone who expected compliance. "Morning," James replied cautiously, stepping out onto the porch. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to personally deliver some exciting news about a new community project," Caroline began, glancing down at her clipboard. James folded his arms, already sensing that this wasn't going to be a simple announcement. "What kind of a project?" "Oh, it's something the neighborhood's been needing for a while now. A modern, safe playground for the kids. Imagine swings, slides, a shaded picnic area. It's going to be wonderful for families." James raised an eyebrow. "That does sound nice. Where's it going to be?" Caroline's smile widened, and for a moment James thought he saw something almost predatory in her expression. "We've chosen your backyard as the perfect location. It's centrally located, spacious, and ideal for the design we've approved." James blinked, certain he hadn't heard her correctly. "My backyard," he repeated, his tone flat with disbelief. "Yes," she confirmed, as if it were the most logical thing in the world. "The HOA board unanimously agreed that your property is the optimal spot for this project. It's all been planned out, and we're moving forward with the initial stages next week." The words hung in the air, heavy and absurd. James stared at her, struggling to process what she had just said. "I'm sorry, but that's not going to happen. This is private property. You can't just decide to take my land." Caroline's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "As a member of the HOA, your property falls under our jurisdiction for community improvements. The board has the authority to make decisions that benefit the neighborhood as a whole." James felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. "I never agreed to anything like this," he said firmly, and you don't have the authority to take my land without my permission." Caroline's expression shifted, her tone hardening. "Mr. Harrison, I understand this is unexpected, but it's important to think about the greater good. The playground will increase property values and provide a safe space for children. Surely you don't want to be the one standing in the way of such a positive initiative." Her words were smooth, practiced, but James could hear the veiled threat beneath them. "This isn't about the greater good," he said, his voice steady but cold. "This is about you and the HOA overstepping your bounds. My backyard isn't community property." Caroline sighed, her polite facade beginning to crack. "I'm trying to be reasonable here, Mr. Harrison. The board has already approved the plans and construction will begin soon. Resisting this decision could lead to fines, legal action, and—" she paused, her eyes locking with his. "Unnecessary stress for your family." The words hit like a slap. Unnecessary stress? Was she threatening him? James took a deep breath, his hands gripping the doorframe to keep himself from exploding. "You'll be hearing from me," he said, his voice low and controlled. Caroline's smile returned, but it was sharper now, almost mocking. "I hope you'll reconsider, for everyone's sake." With that, she turned on her heel and walked back down the driveway, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. James watched her go, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment he stood there, frozen by a mix of anger and disbelief. How could someone be so brazen, so entitled, to think they could just take what wasn't theirs? He looked back toward the backyard, where his kids were still playing, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just begun brewing. The thought of losing that space, their space, was unbearable. It wasn't just about the land. It was about their home, their memories, their rights. As the clouds began to gather overhead, James made a silent promise to himself. He would fight this. No matter how long it took or how hard it became, he wouldn't let Caroline or the HOA strip him of what was his. But as he closed the door and returned to his kitchen, the weight of the coming battle settled heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just a disagreement. It was a war for his family's future. And deep down, James knew it was only the beginning. The days that followed Caroline's visit were anything but peaceful. For James, the threat she had made lingered in the back of his mind, gnawing away at him. He found himself pacing his kitchen late at night, replaying their conversation over and over, searching for some missed clue or detail that might explain how the HOA believed they had the right to take his land. The first sign that Caroline and the HOA weren't bluffing came just 3 days later. James woke to the sound of machinery. Rubbing his eyes, he looked out the window and froze. A group of workers, clad in orange vests, were unloading equipment onto his property. A backhoe sat idle at the edge of his yard, its hulking frame like a predator waiting to strike. Throwing on a jacket, James stormed out the back door. The morning chill bit at his skin, but the anger burning inside him drowned it out. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the sound of metal tools clanging against each other. One of the workers, a man with a clipboard, looked up with mild annoyance. "We're here to start clearing the site for the playground," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "This is my property," James said, his voice rising. "You have no right to be here. Pack up your equipment and leave." The man sighed, flipping through the papers on his clipboard. "According to the HOA, this area has been designated for community use. We're just doing our job." James felt his fists clench. "Well, your job just became illegal. You're trespassing on private property, and if you don't leave, I'll call the police." The man hesitated, clearly not wanting to escalate the situation. He gestured to the workers to pause, muttering something under his breath before walking off to make a phone call. As the workers milled about uncertainly, James took a moment to calm his racing thoughts. He pulled out his phone and began recording the scene. If Caroline and the HOA thought they could bully him, they were in for a rude awakening. That afternoon, James tried to reach Caroline, but his calls went straight to voicemail. He left a message, his tone firm but measured. "Caroline, this is James Harrison. I want to make it absolutely clear that no one has permission to be on my property. If this continues, I will take legal action." But the next day, James received a letter in the mail, stamped with the HOA's logo. It was a formal notice informing him that his resistance to the playground project was being documented and that continued non-compliance could result in fines or legal proceedings. He couldn't believe the audacity. They weren't backing down. They were doubling down. That evening, James sat at his dining room table, surrounded by papers, his property deed, the HOA's bylaws, and a stack of printouts from online forums where others had shared their own horror stories about HOA overreach. "What are we going to do, Dad?" his daughter asked, peeking over the edge of the table. James looked up, his heart sinking. She was only 8, her big brown eyes full of worry she shouldn't have had to carry. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "I'll handle it." But deep down, he felt the weight of the fight ahead. This wasn't just about him anymore. His kids were watching, learning from his actions. If he gave up now, what kind of lesson would that teach them? The next morning, James began reaching out to his neighbors. He knocked on doors, explaining what was happening and asking if anyone else had faced similar issues with the HOA. To his surprise, several of them admitted they'd had run-ins with Caroline before. "She fined me $500 for planting a garden that wasn't aesthetically aligned with the neighborhood," one neighbor said, shaking his head. "She tried to tell me I couldn't build a fence for my dog because it would disrupt the harmony of the community," another added, her voice dripping with sarcasm. As the stories piled up, James realized this wasn't just about his yard. Caroline had been abusing her position for years, using the HOA as a tool to impose her will on the neighborhood. One neighbor, an elderly man named Tom, pulled James aside. "I've got something you'll want to see," he said, leading him into his garage. From an old filing cabinet, Tom produced a stack of documents. Records from HOA meetings and financial statements he'd collected over the years. "Why do you have all this?" James asked, flipping through the papers. Tom shrugged. "I didn't trust her. She's been playing games with people's money and property for a long time. I just never had the fight in me to do anything about it. But maybe you do." James felt a surge of determination. Armed with Tom's documents, he began piecing together a case. He discovered inconsistencies in the HOA's financial records, signs that funds had been misappropriated, and evidence that Caroline had pushed through changes to the HOA bylaws without proper approval. But the most damning discovery was a set of plans showing that Caroline intended to use the playground as a selling point for a new housing development she was invested in just outside the neighborhood. It wasn't about community improvement. It was about lining her own pockets. James knew he had to act fast. He contacted a lawyer, explaining the situation and providing the evidence he had gathered. The lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Lisa, assured him that they had a strong case. "You've got them dead to rights," she said. "But you need to be ready for a fight. People like Caroline don't go down quietly." As James prepared to take his stand, the tension in the neighborhood grew. Some residents sided with him, grateful that someone was finally standing up to Caroline. Others, swayed by her promises of increased property values, accused him of being selfish. Late one evening, James found a note taped to his front door. It was handwritten, unsigned, but the message was clear. Back off, or you'll regret it. James stared at the note, his jaw tightening. He knew he was making enemies, but the thought of giving up never crossed his mind. This was his home, his family's sanctuary, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it away. As the first leaves of autumn began to fall, James stood on his porch, looking out at the yard he had fought so hard to protect. The battle was far from over, but for the first time he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight, and with every piece of evidence he uncovered, he was one step closer to exposing the truth. James stood in his home office, the sunlight cutting through the blinds in narrow, sharp beams, illuminating the stacks of papers and documents scattered across his desk. It had been a grueling few weeks. Between work, parenting, and gathering evidence, his days were packed, and his nights were sleepless. But he had no choice. Caroline and the HOA had escalated the conflict, and James knew this fight was no longer just about his backyard. It was about standing up to an unchecked abuse of power. That morning, Lisa, his lawyer, called with an update. James, I've reviewed everything you sent me, and we have more than enough to move forward. The altered bylaws, the financial discrepancies, the plans for the playground. It all paints a very clear picture of what Caroline is doing, but we need to bring this to light publicly before we go to court. Publicly? James asked, already anticipating the backlash. Yes, Lisa replied firmly. HOAs thrive on fear and secrecy. If we can rally your neighbors and attract attention, it will put additional pressure on Caroline and the HOA board. Trust me, they won't want the scrutiny. That evening, James hosted a meeting in his backyard. Neighbors filed in one by one, some hesitant, others eager to hear what he had to say. He stood on the patio, the old oak tree towering behind him like a silent guardian. Thank you all for coming, James began, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of everything he'd been through. I know many of you have your own stories about issues with the HOA, but what's happening now affects all of us. Caroline and the board are trying to take my land for a playground, but this isn't about community improvement. It's about greed and power. He laid out the evidence he and Lisa had gathered, passing copies of key documents around. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people read Caroline's emails and saw the discrepancies in the HOA's financial records. She's using HOA funds to push a personal agenda, James said, and she's counting on us to stay silent while she does it. One neighbor, Tom, stood up. James is right. I've seen her do this before, and I've stayed quiet because I didn't think anyone would stand up to her. But enough is enough. She works for us, not the other way around. A murmur of agreement spread through the group. Others began sharing their own grievances, unfair fines, arbitrary rule changes, and the general feeling that the HOA was more of a dictatorship than a community organization. The next day, James took Lisa's advice and went to the local news. A reporter from the city's paper came to his home, where he shared his story and the evidence he had collected. The headline that ran the following morning read, HOA President accused of corruption and land grab in suburban community. The story spread quickly. Neighbors who hadn't attended the meeting now had questions. Caroline, who had always maintained a facade of control, found herself cornered. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. The HOA sent out a neighborhood-wide email accusing James of spreading false information and warning residents that misinformation could lead to unnecessary chaos. The email was signed, predictably, by Caroline herself. James couldn't believe the audacity. He forwarded the email to Lisa, who responded almost immediately. This is good for us. The more she tries to silence you, the worse she looks. A week later, James attended the HOA's monthly board meeting, which had been moved to a larger venue to accommodate the increased attendance. Dozens of residents showed up, their faces tense with anticipation. James sat near the front, his stomach knotted but his resolve unshaken. Caroline entered the room with her usual air of confidence, but there was a noticeable crack in her composure. She glanced around, likely noting the unusually large turnout, before taking her seat at the head of the table. The meeting began with routine matters, but when it was time for public comments, James stood up. "I have a question for the board," he began, holding up a copy of the HOA's financial records. "Can you explain why these documents show tens of thousands of dollars being funneled into a project that has not been approved by the majority of residents?" Caroline shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Mr. Harrison, as we've stated before, all decisions made by the board are for the betterment of the community." "That's not an answer," James pressed. "And what about this?" He held up the altered bylaws. "When did residents vote to approve these changes? Because, as far as I can tell, no one here remembers being asked." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Caroline's face flushed red as she attempted to regain control. "Mr. Harrison, this is not the appropriate forum for these accusations." "Then what is the appropriate forum?" James shot back. "Because I've been trying to get answers for weeks, and all I've gotten are threats and vague justifications. We deserve transparency. We deserve accountability." The meeting spiraled into chaos. Residents began demanding answers, their voices rising in frustration. Caroline tried to maintain order, but the momentum had shifted. James had done what he set out to do. He had exposed her for what she truly was. By the end of the night, the board announced an emergency vote to temporarily suspend the playground project, while an independent review of the HOA's finances and procedures was conducted. It was a small victory, but for James, it was proof that standing up had been the right choice. As James walked home that night, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs, he felt a sense of relief. The fight wasn't over, but he had taken the first step toward reclaiming not just his land, but the integrity of his community. For the first time in weeks, he slept soundly. The battle was far from over, but James was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was packed. Residents from the neighborhood had filled the gallery, many of them eager to see how the case against the HOA, and more specifically, Caroline Brooks, would unfold. The tension in the air was palpable, a quiet hum of whispers and rustling papers punctuated by the occasional squeak of a chair. James sat at the plaintiff's table with Lisa by his side, the weight of months of fighting balanced by the confidence he had in his case. Caroline, seated with the HOA's lawyer, looked notably less composed than her usual self. Gone was the sharp, commanding presence she projected at neighborhood meetings. In its place was a woman visibly rattled by the mounting evidence against her. The case opened with Lisa presenting a meticulously organized summary of their claims. She walked the judge through the key points: the forged documents that had altered the HOA's bylaws without proper approval, the misappropriation of HOA funds, and the illegal encroachment onto James's private property. Each point was supported by hard evidence: emails, financial records, and testimony from former board members who had finally come forward. "This case is not just about one man's backyard," Lisa declared, her voice firm but measured. "It's about an abuse of power that has gone unchecked for too long. The HOA, under Caroline Brooks' leadership, has exploited its authority to serve personal interests at the expense of the community. Mr. Harrison has brought this fight to court not only to protect his own rights, but to restore integrity to the HOA and protect his neighbors from further harm." When Caroline took the stand, her demeanor was a mix of defiance and desperation. Her lawyer tried to argue that the HOA had acted within its rights, framing James as a difficult resident who was unwilling to cooperate for the betterment of the community. But under cross-examination, Lisa quickly dismantled their narrative. "Mrs. Brooks," Lisa began, holding up a document, "can you explain why this financial record shows $25,000 allocated to a playground project 2 months before the board formally approved the initiative?" Caroline shifted in her seat, her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "It was preliminary planning. We needed to allocate funds to explore the feasibility." Lisa nodded, her expression calm but sharp. "And can you also explain why that same $25,000 was paid to a contractor who, according to their invoices, began work on Mr. Harrison's property before any community vote had taken place?" Caroline's face reddened. "It was a misunderstanding. The contractor must have misinterpreted the instructions." Lisa didn't let up. "And these emails," she said, holding up another set of documents, "in which you refer to Mr. Harrison's property as a prime location to increase property values for future developments, were those also a misunderstanding?" Caroline didn't answer. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of the judge flipping through the documents Lisa had submitted as evidence. The trial lasted 2 days, but by the end of it, the outcome was clear. The evidence was overwhelming, and Caroline's attempts to justify her actions crumbled under scrutiny. The judge delivered a scathing rebuke of her conduct, declaring her actions not only unethical but also illegal. "Private property rights are a cornerstone of this nation's laws," the judge stated. "The HOA, under the leadership of Mrs. Brooks, has grossly overstepped its authority. Mr. Harrison's rights have been violated in ways that are not only unacceptable but reprehensible." The court ordered the immediate halt of the playground project and mandated that the HOA pay James a substantial settlement for damages, including emotional distress and legal fees. Caroline was also personally fined and removed from her position as president of the HOA. The judge recommended an independent audit of the HOA's finances and procedures to prevent further abuses. For James, the victory was both exhilarating and surreal. As he stepped out of the courtroom, neighbors who had once been hesitant to support him now approached to shake his hand and thank him for his persistence. Tom, the elderly neighbor who had shared his collection of HOA documents, clapped James on the shoulder. "You did it, son," Tom said, his voice filled with pride. "You stood up to her and you won." James smiled, the weight of months of stress finally lifting. "We all did," he replied. "This was never just about me." In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. The HOA underwent significant changes, with new board members elected who prioritized transparency and community input. Caroline moved out of the neighborhood, her reputation in tatters. The playground project was officially scrapped, and James's backyard remained untouched, a symbol of his victory and resilience. One crisp autumn evening, James stood on his patio, watching his kids play beneath the old oak tree. Max barked happily as the children tossed a ball back and forth, their laughter filling the air. For the first time in months, James felt at peace. He had fought for his family, for his home, and for what was right. And he had won. As he leaned against the railing, sipping a glass of iced tea, he thought about the lessons he had learned. Standing up to injustice wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And sometimes, when you fight for what matters most, you inspire others to do the same. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the yard. It wasn't just a backyard. It was a haven, a legacy, and a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, justice could prevail.